Hi, this is Winning Thinking TV on the 9th of June. Absolutely not, actually. We set up this call in all seriousness to establish the new now. Oddly enough, it plays completely to our experience, which is some of the psychological aspects of business along with the hard business side of things. So we're going to try and pull together a pretty eclectic perspective. And I'm delighted today to have Ben Braben, who's got a fascinating background, also military background. And Ben's going to talk about collaboration in relation to the new now, and also what really matters. So over to you, Ben. I think just before I do that, actually, I'd like to also introduce David McLean, who's a former Royal Marine, and David Allen as well, who's a guy from the States and also the UK, a well respected, established tech veteran with a completely different perspective. And David at the end will create a summary. So we'll try and finish in half an hour. Any questions as we're going through, please fire them through. David McLean will try and pick those up. So over to you, Ben. Thank you very much for joining us, and also thank you very much for the guests for joining us too. So,
Tom and David, it's a great pleasure to join you. Thank you very much indeed for welcoming me to this session. And you've asked me to talk about the new now, and are we witnessing the demise of senseless entities, the rise up of collaboration and broader engagement, and the solution? Well, I guess just very briefly by way of background, I've spent the last 4 years running a community called Level 39, which has brought together about 200 predominantly fintech and cybersecurity companies at the heart of Canary Wharf in East London. And it's meant that I've had a pretty exceptional opportunity really to be among many organizations looking to see the different outcomes for those that collaborate compared to those that isolate, to see what it is that marks out those organizations that are most likely to achieve success with customers, but also with recruiting and retaining people, and also with investors. And I guess it's really from that I think this question of the senseless, or more perhaps the opposite, the sensible, sensitive organization is worth exploring. I would suggest that even before COVID-19 arrived and changed all of our lives, it was fairly clear, first of all, that clustering was very important, but secondly, that it was changing. And the reason it's important, of course, is that you bring lots of people together, lots of ideas and lots of problems, you get much more productive activity. Not so much because people form into perfect teams from the beginning, but because it's constantly valuable to bump shoulders with others who you're not in the same team as. It's constantly valuable to be comparing notes with rivals as well as with colleagues and customers. But that has become, of course, much harder as a result of COVID-19, but was anyway beginning to show some signs of trouble. And the reason it was showing signs of trouble are that, of course, you bring people together in clusters and you rob other parts of the country or the world of all of that talent and all of that capital. So it's great for the people who are in the cluster. It's a bit more of a problem for the people who are not. And so I think this is why it's worth considering how organizations benefit from cluster effects while still being socially responsible, while still delivering not just for, to borrow an old political phrase, not just for the few, but for the many. Now, just for a moment, it's perhaps worth dwelling on the challenges that COVID has presented to the two main outcomes of this clustering effect. And those two outcomes, I would suggest, are trust and exposure. What I mean by each of those in turn, first of all, trust. This is the extent to which you can become confident in an organization, even an individual. And that's really a function not of what that organization tells you, not what they publish on their website, not what they print in their reports, but what you hear about them from other people. So if we all consider how we really come to trust other people and other information, it's usually because it comes from an independent source, someone whose trust we have, someone who we believe is dispassionate, but also expert, someone who can help us to triangulate the person or organization we need to know about, rather than simply someone who can provide us with a set of data. And that, of course, is only possible when you have many people coming together. And so trust is a function of clustering, historically. And so is exposure. You don't even get to know about people and organizations unless you have some kind of marketplace environment to bring them together. So these are the two potential losses as a result of dispersing through COVID: trust and exposure. And every entrepreneur, every business leader, I guess right now, should be considering, how do I make sure that I become trusted? And how do I make sure, of course, that people even know I exist? Now, when we're all physically dispersed, both of those things are much harder to do. But there is a way which addresses both trust and exposure. And that's certainly something which for me has become my main effort since the beginning of this crisis. A project I've been working on for 2.5 years called Genie Shares is the main manifestation of this. Genie Shares is a tool to help organizations achieve exposure and trust, and here's how. If as an organization you talk about what you do, your product or your service, then there's only so many people who will be interested at any given time. And even some of the people who would be interested are unlikely to be interested at that time. So you have both a timing and targeting problem. What you do is likely to be quite niche. It's likely to be something which has specific applications at specific times. But the way you do it and the why you do it is not niche. The why you do what you do and the way you do it reflects you as a person and the culture and values of the organization that you're a part of. And therefore, if you think simply of this as an exercise in matching timing and targeting, engaging with people on shared values is vastly more effective than telling them about your product or service. You can always tell them about the product or service later down the line. The business development can follow. But first of all, earn people's attention with a clear indication of the values of you or your business and the way you operate. And that doesn't just solve for timing and targeting. Critically, it solves for trust and exposure as well, because it's far easier to decide whether you trust somebody when you understand them, if you like, at the values level, rather than when you're conducting due diligence on a particular technology or service proposition. So here's to cut to the chase. Here's the takeaway, if you like. If you can spend your time during this time of social distancing, building relationships based upon shared values rather than shared technical specifications, your time will be better spent. There will be opportunities later to fill in the technical gaps, to close the sale. But in the meantime, you will be building yourself and your organization a much richer fabric. You'll be able to benefit, in other words, from a cluster of values rather than a cluster of geography. And I would suggest that that is the best bet for any organization which wants to win the future. Any organization which wants to recognize that in the post-COVID era, if there is a post-COVID era, but certainly in the later stages of this era, those organizations who can demonstrate they deliver value for whole communities, that they engage with not only their existing customers and investors and employees, but really have something for volunteers, carers, key workers, that their success as a business is a function of the success of the community of which they're a part and upon which they depend, then I would suggest you have an organization which will win the future. That's why values should be the heart of our activities through this crisis and beyond it.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ben. That's fascinating. I love it as well because I disagree with quite a lot of the terminology you use there. I think there's a very interesting dynamic around values. There's a fine dividing line between a tyranny of tolerance and values and giving ourselves the space. In terms of collaboration, we cluster people around a problem in a very off-piste to evaluate a situation before we actually engage. How do you cluster people around problems? What do you think good looks like, Ben, in the sort of collaborative environment that you think is ideal?
Well, I think that the best use of people's time is something which they are better placed to judge than almost anyone else. So it seems to me sensible to conduct a series of low-cost experiments to, if you like, reveal a little bit of interest here, a little bit of interest here, and see what people respond to. Now, some people will respond, first of all, for example, to sincere expressions of faith and belief. Others, we touched on this a little earlier, others will respond first and most effectively to humor.
Yeah.
And I think none of these are mutually exclusive. You can conduct little experiments where you try a joke, you share a little bit about your beliefs, and you see what people respond to. And then you respond more on that. Critically, I suppose this is more to highlight what you don't necessarily feel the need to do, which is don't rush to talking about the thing it is that you sell.
Yeah.
And it's so, just to sort of to stretch that point slightly, the people who seem to be most effective at selling are often those who don't spend very much time talking about selling. They're those who become network nodes rather than endpoints. And by expressing values, you're doing exactly that. You're weaving yourself into a much richer fabric than simply saying, call me when you want to buy one of these.
Yeah. Yeah, fantastic. And if there's one thing over and above anything else that really matters, Ben, what is it?
What a fantastic question. I think it is probably something like patience. Patience in being prepared to take the time it takes to create value which is sustainable and healthily earned and legitimately retained.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's really very interesting. Yeah.
Ben, can I ask you a question, just, sort of along these lines, in terms of what you're thinking and saying? So the people who are school teachers in this country have just spent somewhere between 3 and 4 weeks drafting, focusing, making plans, building plans to bring all the primary schools back in. Now, the government announced this morning, not happening until September. What can the government do to help build trust with that group of people, since they've just spent 4 weeks doing something and then they've said, no, not doing that?
Well, I guess education policy is above my pay grade, but the general point that I have great sympathy, by the way, for people in political life as well as the rest of us, because I don't think their job is easy. And if when it does appear there's something easy about it, it's usually because we haven't dug deep enough into it. Having said that, clearly they are changing things, and that's inflicting real costs on a whole host of sectors of the economy, including teachers. Here's a principle, which I guess should be a useful guiding principle for us all. It's a question of mutuality. And that's why with Genie Shares, for example, rather than giving a lecture about business or technology or economics, entrepreneurs simply give a sliver of their business to someone else. And if you're doing that, then you're effectively making common cause. You're aligning yourself and your own future. So I think, often in policy, you see something like this where industries are required to extract downstream of where they emit, for example. They are required to internalize the consequences. Now, the government, of course, has a huge to-do list, but in demonstrating why to teachers that decision has been made, it might at least show that it's trying to balance their interests and needs with those of others.
I mean, one of the things we know about school children, all children, they have parents. One of the difficult things that those parents mostly work. And so if those children are not in school, then they have to be taken care of by those people called parents. And if they're having to take care of the children, then they're not working. It has a vast implication on our economy, all the way across. But to suddenly just, we're not doing this. I'm just wondering your thoughts on how you, there's going to be an endless queue of some very pissed off teachers by this afternoon. But what do you do? What do you say?
Well, I guess controlling the message is incredibly difficult, isn't it? And I imagine, but I'm not sure, that they may have sought to deliver a rather more rounded message. Although, of course, that's sometimes a luxury of time, and they may not have had it. And this government has made some very significant communications errors. Regardless of the substance of its decisions, it's made some significant and probably avoidable communications errors, which perhaps with a little bit more time might have been avoided, perhaps with different people or priorities might have been averted. But I guess there's two parts to this, isn't there? There's the actual policy question. Was it the least bad option? And then there's the communications question. Could they have broken the news slightly healthier? Perhaps they could.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Ben. That's cool. So I'm going to share something different, but a different perspective, but talking about a similar sort of thing in relation to a business that I was involved with. It was a microfinance business, and it was a consumer lending business in Birmingham, and it'd been ransacked with fraud. And also there were some real serious challenges with these sorts of businesses because it had all the associations of Wonga, and people thought that these businesses were ripping customers off, yet it was a very necessary service. And it's also very important that people get their money from a safe place. And so what we did was we got the business model right. We figured out how to make money, and actually it is a very expensive service. So there's a real cost to servicing short-term loans to individuals because it requires a relationship. I think this is where the common denominator is with what you're saying, Ben, because the simple logic of this was if there was no trust and no relationship, you simply would not get your money back. And it's very interesting to see how the competitors actually went about this. So Prudential was a business that was set up on really good foundations going back about 100 years when the UK was really in a mess, a bit like it is today. And they went online, completely destroyed all their customer relationships and destroyed their business almost overnight. Wonga had some internal issues which, in terms of reloaning loans, which created a compound issue. And this is really, yet this service was required. So what we actually did, what was interesting about this was it was a business where, if you look at the balance sheet, it's almost utterly worthless. And I think this is the new norm, because if you look at a lot of assets at the moment, in terms of house prices, a lot of businesses, particularly tech businesses, there's not much on the balance sheet. And even there's some big question marks over commercial property. And I think we're moving into an era now where unless we actually are maintaining relationships in difficult circumstances, then we are simply not going to create sustainable businesses. So I think and also there's a challenge with digital as well, because the basis of profitability that consistently throughout of all of our case studies is always relationships, and that's people relationships. And people, I think, confuse that with customer experience and a slick customer experience. But I think the digital side of this is actually almost the antithesis. When we study digital businesses, notice there's falling profits and a lot of automation, which actually reduces the relationship. So I think, that what I'd add to what you just said, I agree, although I'd use different words. And I think there's some interesting discussion around the value side of this, Ben, in terms of, being liberal and having the right direction, but also not being prescriptive, because we're not, as human beings, we don't fit very neatly into boxes. But I think it's about how do we create organisations, and I think relationships are absolutely critical to purely operating. I think balance sheets moving forwards are going to get shot to pieces, and I think this is also symptomatic with this tragic situation in the States and how that's manifested itself. So we have to be very, very careful about the lawlessness side of this, because if we get this wrong, we're actually on the edge of lawlessness, and it's becoming critical to manage relationships in these tough times. So I think that's what I'd add to what you've just said, Ben. David McLean, what are your thoughts from the people side that you've
Yes, thank you. Thanks very much, Ben. I appreciate that, and Tom, obviously. Obviously, I understand. I know Ben, and I understand GenieShares, and I'm a big fan of it, as you know. And the bringing the cohesion together, that what you're doing there is a really important thing, and it plays obviously well with the points that you've made in terms of trust and that function of collaboration. How do people become trusted? That shared values aspect, but I'm interested in the individual as well, because all change starts at home. All change starts with the individual, and as a group, we're obviously interested in that as well in terms of the businesses that we work with. What do you think about the changes, internal change starts, and I suppose actually first of all understand a little bit more about what trust is. Trust in the individual. So it's about belief in themselves. It's as if you actually were looking at my notes earlier on, Ben, because everything you said is actually what I've got down. It's a belief in yourself. It's about being reliable. It's about having faith, and not necessarily, religious faith, although it can be that, but faith in yourself, so that you're able to come to the party, you're able to come to that point to be able to collaborate. So I suppose the question is, how do you believe, or what do you think is necessary to be able to strengthen the trust within yourself so that you're able to move forward and lead?
It's a fantastic question. I guess that faith in self, just like faith in others, trust in others, is not to be confused with transparency. So very often people put trust and transparency together. If something's transparent, there's no need for trust, because you can see everything there is to see about it. You only really need trust when something isn't transparent. Now, a person's never fully transparent. So when you're dealing with people, you're always going to feel a degree of uncertainty. And this is as true of yourself as it is of others. You might doubt your abilities. You might doubt it'll always be, I guess, a doubt of abilities. You might doubt what you can depend upon about yourself. And that's living with that uncertainty seems to me to be the faith which is required of all of us. If we're going to lead anybody, we need to acknowledge that they too may have legitimate doubts about us as well as about themselves. And so it seems to me, this is why, I guess, sharing your values is a powerful thing, because you're publishing your operating system, I suppose you could say. You're explaining to people, under these conditions, this is what I believe matters. And particularly at times when we're all provided with good reasons to have doubts and concerns, whether it's through COVID or through economic shocks to our society, those people like you who can lean forward and say, well, I don't have any guarantees myself, but I believe enough to share my success. I believe enough to say, whatever happens to me, I will put some of my winnings, my earnings, my achievements in trust for other people. That's a very, very powerful way. That is, of course, the GenieShares model. And that is a very powerful way of saying it's perfectly legitimate to have doubts. We all have those about ourselves and about others. And what we're trying to do in building trust is actually build mutual recognition. Yeah. And you can't really trust others unless you trust yourself, and vice versa, I believe.
Yeah. I think there's a mechanism I'd comment on that, Ben, which is called giving without expecting anything in return, which is, in my view, one of the powers of GenieShares. It shows real commitment. Very often in business, we give expecting something in return, and actually there's not much joy in that. So I think it's, I think your model, GenieShares, I love it. Very fascinated to understand more. So thanks for that. David, David Allen, how are you doing? Any thoughts you'd like to add?
Not really a lot. I have to say, Ben, that these two things of trust and exposure are, really, it's an interesting thing to contemplate how we go forward with this new normal, because this is the first time in probably hundreds of years that the entire world, regardless of political inclination or type of government or type of environment, had one common enemy, had one thing that there wasn't any question whether you were in Wuhan or you were in New York or Seattle or Paris or London, that do we consider coronavirus the enemy? And 100% of the people would say yes. And of course, we don't know what the future holds. We don't know where any of that goes. So I think that the trust and exposure thing are really, really good. But I think the third increment you brought out about patience is because we have all come from an instantaneous consumption world, a world that said, if I want this, I can get it, and I can get it now, and Amazon will deliver it in 2 hours. That builds a sort of mentality, and it's one that is no longer functional or working or anything else. And so the whole world is stepping out of its reality, and you can put a great deal of effort into trying to determine exactly what that reality is one way or the other. But the act of stepping out of it and the act of stepping into something new is I think what's really crucial here. And I followed a little bit of what you've done at GenieShares, and I think that's sort of underlying where the whole thing has to go. Not that it could go, but has to go going forward. So it's a great privilege to have you here, and I think we've got a bunch of questions that are really interesting, David.
Yeah.
Yes, we certainly do. Quite a few questions. So I've asked a little bit of clarification on the first one, Nick, if you don't mind. It's Nick Brown. So we'll go on to the second one from Sean Foley. Visions, values, leadership first. Problem solving, product and process second. So is it trust-based relationships first then? Would you agree? Ben, if you could.
Wow, that's almost like a memory test. That's a long list of important ingredients, Sean. Thank you. I guess in any long list, you need to choose where you're going to begin. And I would suggest, yes, no matter how you bring these ingredients together in your cooking pot, it's the values which really, if you like, explain the method of mixing. So you'll change the relative weight of different things. Sometimes the product will seem more important. Sometimes the way in which you present it, in media terms, for example. But always, I think, the bedrock of this is the values. And they're an ingredient which, after all, is the most fundamental, but actually also famously also vulnerable. If you betray the values, then everything else fails. So you must always treat them as more important than everything else.
I'll just add something briefly to that. I think relationships and empathy matter as much as anything, because when things get difficult, it's our knowledge of each other that holds things together. And things are getting seriously difficult. So empathy, I think, is something I'd add to what you've just said, Ben. I agree with what you just said.
Lovely. And thanks, Sean. A question from Nick Brown. What is the one compelling proposition that would get firms on the path to brand engagement?
Wow, for that you really do need a genie. You need a magician to answer this question, don't you? Because I guess it will probably be different for every firm. I suppose the format ingredient, like with GenieShares, we've sought to create a sort of, yes, I guess it is a one size fits all, a single thing which every entrepreneur can do. And that is effectively to say, look, you don't need to know for sure what my outcome will be, what my brand represents. You don't need to have that clear in your mind right now. I'm going to invite you to come with me on the journey. Now, often, of course, entrepreneurs will do that by saying, I'm going to invite you to come on that journey by buying my product. And if they communicate it very well, that can be successful. But this is different. This is about saying, come with me on this journey to a place in which ownership more fairly and accurately reflects a sustainable, healthy society. So I would suggest, getting my way to answering your question with a single word, the answer is ownership. And GenieShares is a step in that direction, but it's one among many ways in which we can modify our sense of ownership. For the last 10 years, people have often talked about the sharing economy, saying access trumps ownership. And that, of course, has been the basis of growth of whole industries like Uber. But I think beyond this crisis, when we see that not only, there's huge unrest, not only in the United States, but across the world, demonstrating how many people have been at a systematic disadvantage, coming hot on the heels of a growing awareness in this country that we have systematically under-recognized and under-supported key workers and people in our communities who don't have formal jobs, but still bring cohesion. Until and unless your brand can answer the question, how do I acknowledge how many of these people matter? Well, then you're still going to be vulnerable.
Lovely. Thank you. We've got two more questions if we've got time. One from Ayas, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Apologies if I'm not. So there's a little bit of a background here in the questions at the end. BlackRock have made a statement that it expects the companies it invests in to pay more attention to their multiple stakeholders, including society and the environment, rather than just its investors. It sounds to me like what Ben is talking about, if I understood it correctly, is that another way to address this is to bring other stakeholders into the investor class. How does this work in practice when it is only a minority of individuals who would look at investing?
Thank you. This is a great question, yes. I would suggest that Genie Shares is just part of this. There are many other ways to make sure that your ownership accurately reflects the society of which you're a part and upon which you depend. Now, with Genie Shares, we don't invite people to buy shares because you're right, not everyone can. In the UK, average net worth of the bottom 50% of the population by wealth is £5,000. Now, if that's your average net worth, it's highly unlikely you own any equity in anything. It's also very unlikely you'll, as a result, experience any upside in anything. You're not likely to see big returns to your portfolio because you don't have a portfolio in the conventional stocks and shares sense. So for people who are, and that's half the population, for people who are in that sort of situation, business growth is a fairly abstract, remote concept. If, however, you own a bit of equity, or, and this is critical, if you know people do who are a bit like you in some way, who are relatable to you, then you may take more of an interest. So this is not just about who actually owns the companies that create value and growth. It's about the fact that the people who do are more representative and among us. And that's why Genie Shares adopts a policy of distributing in a slightly unpredictable way. So it's not an exercise in finding out which individuals are particularly worthy or deserving. There are many who are worthy and deserving, and not all of them will fit on your cap table. You can't have your business owned by everybody, but you can find people who you can tell a story about ownership with, which other people will buy into and believe. In other words, what you can do by your behavior is set an example so that everyone begins to think, well, I may not own that business, but I can see that businesses like that belong to people a bit like me sometimes. And I want business broadly to succeed. And I particularly want that business because the leaders of that business show that they care.
Fantastic. A question from Steve Wynn to Ben. You're popular, which is great. As trust is harder to build in the COVID virtual world, how do you overcome this to build trust without the face-to-face interaction?
Well, Steve, I think this is absolutely the key challenge of so many people businesses, and which businesses aren't people businesses. I don't have a particularly ready answer except to say that it seems to be on the basis of values. I think that this is the least bad answer. Of course, my job used to be to bring hundreds of people together in Canary Wharf and kind of kettle them into a relatively small space and fuel them with pizza and beer, of course, on the one hand, but ideas on the other. We can't do the physical bringing together and we can't do the pizza or the beer, but we can certainly double down on those ideas. And the idea which seemed in the 2.5 years that I've been developing Genie Shares with the help of hundreds and hundreds of collaborators, the most compelling idea I came across was this idea of mutuality. This idea that the proper response to growing inequality driven by business, growing equality driven by technology business in particular, was to stop, if you like, banging on about technical arguments, about economic arguments, about trickle-down economics, but instead simply to say, look, I'm doing my thing over here, and you're doing your thing over there. Let's find our common ground. What do we both believe matters?
And there's one final question, actually, which is really good, a good one to finish on, for another one from Nick Brown. Ben speaks sense. Why do more firms not follow this advice, the advice, the exposure, trust, and the key points that you're bringing out there? And what are the common barriers?
Well, another great question, Nick. Thank you. From my very limited experience, and I'd really emphasize, although I've been surrounded by lots of technology companies, I'm conscious that that's still a tiny, tiny part of the world at large. I've noticed it takes a truly exceptional kind of a person to do something new. And with Genie Shares, I found someone called Peter Kelly, who was the very first to do this. And what I asked of him was totally crazy. It was to give away 1% of the business that he had spent 3 years building to a complete stranger. Now, of course, I had discussed this with many people before Peter, and many of them went, well, that sounds interesting. Well, that would be quite fun, wouldn't it? There'd be lots of sort of playing around with the idea. But then, of course, inevitably, habit would set in. It's really hard to change habits. It takes truly exceptional people to say, well, yes, most of the crowd is going that way, but I'm going to try going that way. Peter did. And of course, we've discussed that what he did had value in its own right. And this shouldn't be viewed cynically. It also transformed the success of his business because his customers were so thrilled by his expression of values that they sought to do as much business with him as possible. Now, I don't think you should say he did it because of that, or that happened because exclusively of what he did. This is an expression, part of expression of the way he as a person runs his business. But it takes a truly exceptional person to have the courage to do something new and to share the value of what they do with others. And Peter, if you like, stepped out of the trench first. I am thrilled to see how many people are now starting to follow. What they all have in common is that they are courageous early adopters. My belief is that during the course of the next couple of years, this will become a subject not so much of courage as a matter of habit. It will become normal because impressive, bold people are leading the way and showing not only does this not harm you, it improves your business. It makes your employees more proud to be with you. It actually, your investors quickly realize that 99% of an awesome business is worth more than 100% of a pretty good business. And most importantly of all, it makes sure that your whole community values what you do. You will enjoy a following wind from every healthcare worker, every regulator, every policymaker, every communicator, every family member who supports, silent, unpaid, your colleagues when they come to work.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Over to Tom and David.
Yeah, so David, what are your thoughts in terms of wrapping this up? What are the main points?
Well, Ben's done a fantastic job of articulating a couple of really key things that we can take away with. The difficulty is, in these sorts of things when people are talking about the new now, they pontificate about this and that and the other thing. And, we got down to some very good specific things here, Ben. And so because we're very short of time, I'm not going to go into anything further than that, just to say thank you for being very visceral, very bottom line, and very direct. And it was great to have you here.
It's a pleasure to join you.
Thank you very much, Ben. I'd just like to add, look forward to continue this discussion. You certainly are on an exciting route, so thank you very much for your contribution.
So thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you.
Cheers, guys.